Well, good evening. Good evening and welcome to the fourth event in the 2009-2010 Humanities Lecture Series. I'm Victor Bailey, Director of the Hall Centre, which organises the entire set of lectures. It's our great privilege this evening to bring you soldier, diplomat, Harvard academic, best-selling author, and would-be Member of Parliament, Rory Stewart. And he's still only in his 30s. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Kansas Public Radio. It's also made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Mr. Stewart will take questions after his talk if you would make your way to one of the two microphones. Afterwards, he will sign copies of his books in the Big 12 room, which is opposite this auditorium, where there will also be a reception. All are welcome. As you will see on the back page of your program, we have succeeded in rescheduling poet Mary Oliver for May the 5th in the Leeds Centre. We were pleased to learn that her pneumonia has cleared up quickly. To introduce Rory Stewart, I've asked Professor Leslie Tuttle, Professor of European History at KU. Leslie teaches classes on women's history, the history of sexuality, and general European history. Her first book is close to appearing with Oxford University Press. Entitled Conceiving the Old Regime, the book traces the French monarchy's growing intervention in the marital and sexual lives of French men and women in the 17th and 18th centuries. She was recently named one of 30 recipients of a 2010 National Humanities Centre Fellowship, chosen from 442 applications submitted from institutions in the US and from around the world. She will spend, therefore, next academic year in North Carolina at the National Humanities Center, a non-profit institution for advanced study in the humanities. Leslie got on to Rory Stewart, so to speak, earlier than anyone I know, and recommended him to us. Since no good deed goes unpunished, I asked her to tell us about him this evening. So please welcome Professor Leslie Tuttle.
Thank you very much, Victor. I'm so honored to be here tonight. In January 2002, a 29-year-old former British soldier and diplomat set out to walk across the central mountains of Afghanistan. It was just weeks after the fall of the Taliban. The Mujahideen escorts assigned to him for the first part of his journey confidently predicted that he would be killed somewhere along the 400 miles of ancient Silk Road that separated Herat from Kabul. Rory Stewart himself muses over that likelihood in the early pages of The Places in Between, his deeply moving account of his trek. The book became an international bestseller, and I was an avid reader. Stewart's improbable appearance in remote Tajik and Hazara villages inspired many guesses about his motivations. Many of the hosts who fed and sheltered him had never heard of his native Scotland. Was he a soldier, an aid worker, a journalist, an outcast, a CIA agent? Pressed to state his purposes, Stewart defined himself as a historian. He chose his mountain route to follow the path of the 16th century Mughal Emperor Babur. Impressively, the long and rich history of Afghanistan is as much a part of his story as the country's turbulent present and uncertain future. Mile after mile of footsteps brought him into direct contact with a culture scarred by a generation of war, past minefields, abandoned development projects, and bazaars where the artifacts of a lost pre-Muslim civilization were up for sale. Afghanistan fascinated Stewart as a place in between, in many ways, between the deserts and the Himalayas, between Persian, Hellenic, and Hindu cultures, between Islam and Buddhism, between mystical and militant Islam. He wanted, he said, to see where these cultures merged into one another or touched the global world. His timing coincided, as we now see, with the moment when the places in between moved to the very center of public discourse in the United States and Western Europe. The child of a Scottish civil servant, Rory Stewart was born in Hong Kong and spent much of his childhood in Malaysia. He went to school at Eton and at Balliol College, Oxford. In the 8 years since his Afghan walk, Stewart's engagement with the region he wrote about has taken highly divergent paths. In 2003, fueled by what he has since labeled a naive belief that he could do some good, he accepted a position as deputy governor of a southern province of Iraq under the Coalition Provisional Authority. That experience generated yet another critically acclaimed best-selling book, The Prince of the Marshes. Since, he has worked to establish the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, an NGO that provides employment to young Afghans by training them in the exquisite and endangered techniques of Afghan traditional crafts. The foundation also works to renovate and preserve the old town of Kabul. Stewart has advised British and American politicians on Afghan culture and policy. He currently holds the Ryan Family Professorship and serves as director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where he teaches War, States, and Intervention, a course about post-conflict states aimed at the practitioners who may be tasked with rebuilding them. Now, as if to vindicate the journalist who quipped that he is, quote, vying to assemble the most astonishing obituary of his generation, Stewart is poised to bring his particular experience-honed brand of skepticism about the limits of intervention to the British Parliament. Last year, he won the open primary to be Conservative Party candidate for the constituency of Penrith and the Border, considered one of the party's safest seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rory Stewart to the University of Kansas.
Thank you very much indeed. I've had an increasingly happy and exciting day in Kansas, which began with finally discovering what a jayhawk was. It's a very important revelation for me. And a very beautiful day. And thank you for your hospitality, particularly to the Hall Center for the Humanities and for these very kind and over-generous introductions. I'm going to try to focus today a little bit on contemporary foreign policy, in particular the American administration, the Obama administration's policy in Afghanistan. And in the course of it, I may show some images of Afghanistan. I've got a big presentation up here, but I'm not going to begin with that because I think we are very, very familiar now, all of us in this room, with images of Afghanistan. It's not necessary, I think, anymore to show you pictures with which we are so familiar. All of us, when we look at a newspaper, see these often black and white pictures of Afghans portrayed lying in pools of blood, begging in burqas, in burn wards, sighted through a rifle's sights, or in other words, portrayed as victims. We often think of Afghans as victims. And indeed, many of the ways in which our politicians speak about Afghans reflects this idea that somehow this is a poor, benighted medieval country, fragile, traumatized zone emerging from 30 years of war, a place which is to be pitied, a charity case. I'm going to begin by laying out a glimpse of what I believe the President's policy to be, I'm going to touch on what I think is wrong with that policy, try to discuss maybe why that policy is going wrong, what the features of it are which are misleading, and then I'm going to try to suggest what a better policy might be. I do this, though, and I just want to say this from the beginning, very, very much from a position of relative ignorance. There are people in this room who have served in Afghanistan. I've just seen 3 looking around the room. There are people in this room who know much more about Afghan history than I do. There are even Afghans in this room who know far more, obviously, than I do. So this is very much a foreigner's perspective. It's the perspective of somebody who, to put my cards on the table, I walked across Afghanistan in the winter of 2001-2002. I worked there a little bit in 2003, 2004, and then I lived there from the end of 2005 till the end of 2008, running a non-profit on the ground in Kabul. But my focus has mostly been on the center and the north of the country. I know less about the south and the east of the country. For me to stand up and lecture people on the history of Afghanistan would be a bit as though an Afghan had spent 3 years living in Kansas and had returned to Afghanistan to lecture people on the Constitution of the United States, right? It's a cheeky thing to do. And so, in addition, I am no great expert even on the administration's policy. I was lucky enough in the early days to be able to speak to Secretary Clinton, to see Ambassador Holbrooke, to see General Petraeus and General McChrystal and various others, but I saw them very much as an outsider. And I bring a little bit of experience from working in Iraq, from working as a diplomat, to my discussion. But again, a lot of this are hints followed by guesses. And one of the things I want to say is that in some ways the problem either of explaining our policy in Afghanistan or criticizing it is that it is fundamentally quite vague, quite difficult to pin down, quite difficult to fully understand what we think we are doing. Sometimes we have a sort of fake precision, a kind of jargon is used, a kind of language is used, which makes it sound as though we know where we're going and what we're up to. So people will stand up and say, particularly in the early days, beginning of 2002, we're creating a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law, or through the implementation of transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes. This kind of jargon, these kinds of statements are often revelations of what we do not have rather than the plan of how to get them. So to say we can eliminate corruption through transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes is simply a way of saying the current processes in Afghanistan are neither transparent nor predictable nor accountable, but are not exactly a plan on how to rectify it. What then is the vision coming from the White House? Well, the vision laid out in the President's two main policy statements, and to some extent in McChrystal's strategic review, as you will be aware, through the statements that you will have come across throughout 2009, broadly speaking, defines their presence in Afghanistan, our presence in Afghanistan, and I'll use the we because this is a coalition operation, it's a NATO operation, in terms of al-Qaeda, in terms of disrupting and dismantling, defeating al-Qaeda. Quite a narrow objective and deliberately set out at the beginning of the President's speech in quite narrow terms. There was a sense in those early days that what he was trying to do is differentiate himself from an idea that somehow perhaps the Bush administration had gone too broad, had tried to take on more than it could handle. So this very, very narrow objective, which is to deal with al-Qaeda. And yet the means to that end, the way to deal with al-Qaeda, turned out to be very, very broad. So a very narrow objective, but a huge means to that end, which encompassed, amongst other things, centrally, counterinsurgency, about which more later, state building, development, regional stability, counter-narcotics. So the idea seems to be that it is not enough, if you wish to deal with al-Qaeda, to simply conduct narrow counter-terrorist operations. Not enough to fly special forces around, not enough to use predator drones. In order to deal with al-Qaeda, the theory goes, you need this full pyramid of other activities, which amounts to defeating the Taliban, creating a stable, functioning, effective, legitimate state. What is the problem with this theory? Well, I would suggest one major problem with this theory, and we can come back to some others later, is that it is an unbelievably demanding and costly project. The project of creating a stable state, of dealing with a failed state, of winning a counterinsurgency campaign, is a project which will absorb a very large number of resources, which will absorb a lot of lives, which will absorb, above all, a great deal of time. This is a very big project. And the United States has many other interests in the world, many other responsibilities in the world. Afghanistan is not the only thing we have to worry about. We are already overstretched. We are already countries that are facing severe financial crises. We are countries that are struggling to keep up with the current tempo of operations. In that context, Afghanistan is one of perhaps 40 countries which we need to worry about. If we're worried about terrorism, Pakistan is more important. If we're worried about regional stability, Egypt or Iraq is more important. If we're worried about poverty, Africa is more important, and that's before you get on to talking about the threats that might be presented by Iran or North Korea or China or Russia, or even by things which are neither failed states nor states. Climate change, renewed financial crisis. Our responsibilities are many. And perhaps the most fundamental responsibility facing a President of the United States is not just his responsibility to the people of Afghanistan or Nepal or Pakistan or Kenya, but his responsibility to his own people, his responsibility to the people of the United States. If I'm right that we have got this out of proportion, if I'm right that we are investing more resources, more energy, more time into this place than it warrants, than its importance actually justifies, why is it that we're doing this? What is it about our culture? What is it about our politics? What is it about our media that leads us to do this? These are some suggestions. One of them, I think, is that we live in a culture which is driven, particularly in our political language, by fear, by an obsession with the very, very worst case scenario, with a serious reluctance to accept risk, by a desire to portray a country like Afghanistan as almost the worst thing imaginable. If you read, for example, Ahmed Rashid's book, Descent into Chaos, you see Afghanistan portrayed as a place which, were it somehow to fail, were this project somehow to fail, the most astonishing and extreme consequences would follow for the world. Amongst them would be the creation of large international terrorist training camps, which would lead to renewed and serious international terrorist attacks against the United States. Right? Those were the kinds of things we talked about at the end of 2001. And indeed, some of these arguments I'm about to present for why Afghanistan matters, why it's so terrifying, have almost emerged year by year since 2001. We've experimented with different reasons. So the first reason was that we're worried about terrorism. By 2002, 2003, we were beginning to think in more humanitarian developmental terms. So the second great fear of Afghanistan, which is that were we to fail in Afghanistan, Afghanistan would slip back into a benighted horror of civil war, Taliban resurgence, oppression of women, grinding poverty. So I suppose the second kind of way in which we frame it is in terms of development. The third, which began to worry us towards the end of 2003, beginning of 2004, it had been there before, but worried us more then, was drugs. Right? Afghanistan is the source of 93% of the world's heroin. Right? Drugs flooding the streets of European cities in particular. Then, by the beginning of 2006, we began to worry about the Taliban. Began to worry about this as a source of insurgency. The Taliban, of course, being different from al-Qaeda. This is no longer, in the most traditional narrow sense, a counter-terrorist campaign. This is beginning to worry about people who are not primarily concerned with attacking the United States, no longer concerned with Osama bin Laden and his group of middle and upper-class Arabs, but instead concerned with a group who are predominantly Afghans, Pakistanis from the Pushtu Belt, with a relatively narrow provincial agenda, which began, at least, at the creation of a particular kind of state in Afghanistan. Right? Then we began worrying about regional stability. We began to believe that Afghanistan was crucial to the stability of Pakistan, that somehow if Afghanistan fell, Pakistan would in some way be destabilized, and if Pakistan was destabilized, then this great country on the border of India would end up, and again because we tend towards the worst case scenario, would end up in a situation in which mullahs would have their fingers on the nuclear triggers in Islamabad. By, I suppose, the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, we added to this a real classic fear, which is a fear about our own credibility and reputation. We cannot be seen to be defeated. Were NATO to be defeated in Afghanistan, it would destroy the greatest NATO operation ever, destroy NATO itself. Were the United States to be seen to be defeated, it would embolden global jihadists all over the world and would fundamentally undermine our strategic position. I'm going to come back to these because these are exaggerated fears. Right? These are things which are not as bad as they sound, but they are the kind of arguments from which things are driven. For a number of reasons. One of them, we can come back to why these phenomena happen, but one of them is simply in order to justify and sell a war, it's very, very convenient to have a worst-case scenario. It's not very easy to say to soldiers who are going out to die, we have some kind of moderate strategic interests in Afghanistan and some kind of obligations to the people there, commensurate with perhaps 40 other countries in the world, and I suppose the reasonable expenditure of some lives and some money in Afghanistan might, over 20 or 30 years, contribute to the stability of the region and this isn't really something that's going to sell domestically or to the soldiers themselves as a reason for which you give your life. You give your life because this place is central, because this place is, to take a term beloved of the last administration, an existential threat. Right? And an existential threat is a very interesting kind of threat. An existential threat is almost by definition a threat so extreme that there is almost no limit to the amount of resources which you will invest in it. This is no longer a poker game. This is no longer a game where you say, okay, how much is on the table? How much have I got to bet to play? What are my chances of winning? No, I think I'll fold this hand because it's not worth staying in the game, right? An existential threat is one which says, for some reason, however little is in the pot, however small my chances of winning, however extravagant the amount that I'm going to have to stake to stay in the game, I have to stay in the game because I cannot afford to lose. So, number one, the existential threat, fear, driving our policy. Number two, a sense of moral obligation. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that in justifying what we're doing, we talk about ourselves as having a moral obligation to the Afghan people. We talk about it in different ways. Sometimes we use pottery barn analogies. We broke the country, we're obliged to fix it. Right? Sometimes we just say, are you seriously saying that we ought to do nothing about these people who are extremely poor? Ought we really to do nothing about letting the Taliban take over? Are you saying that we ought to support the Taliban partitioning the country or retaking Kabul? Right, so an extraordinary sense of moral obligation. And very interestingly, a kind of moral obligation, which again, a bit like our fears, we don't really want to limit in any way. We don't want to come along and say, ought implies can. Right? We don't want to say, you don't have a moral obligation to do what you cannot do. Right? We don't come along and say, what are the limits to this obligation? Well, let's say we can't do anything about this situation. Do we still have an obligation to keep pretending that we can do something about it? Right? Third element, fear, moral obligation. Third element, a vision which, to use a pretentious word, I would call monist, which is to say an idea that everything tends to the same thing. not a pluralist vision, not a vision that we have a whole series of separate objectives or agendas, but that everything we do in the country is really one and the same and reinforces one and the same objective. If you read, for example, the Counterinsurgency Warfare Manual, right, if you were to go down the road to Fort Leavenworth and have a look at that manual, or many of you in the audience will have already read it, you will discover that the thing reads a little bit like a World Bank policy document. There is almost nothing that is not in that document. There is very little there which you read in that or stability operations where you get a clear idea of where being the military stops and being something else begins. The preface to the book is written by my predecessor as the director of the Carr Center of Human Rights Policy at Harvard. You go through it, you will see reference to governance, state building, the rule of law, development, civil society. And none of these things are seen as mutually exclusive. We never believe that we have to make any choices. We don't think there are any trade-offs here. We don't think that in the process of constructing the state, you might have to choose whether today, in this particular conversation with this particular man or in this particular village, you are going to make a priority of security or development or winning hearts and minds or succeeding in implementing human rights or reinforcing legitimacy and the credibility of the Afghan government or the credibility of the United States or our security or their development. No, all these things are the same. They're all the same thing. They're different words for the same thing. In fact, the president says this explicitly. He says, their development is our security. Or we make necessary sufficient connections. You cannot have security without development. You cannot have development without security. Why do you want a democracy? Well, because democracies deliver development. Now, why is it you want to fight the Taliban? Well, because if you have the Taliban, you have Al-Qaeda. Why are you fighting poverty? Because if you have poverty, you have Al-Qaeda. Why are you building a state? Because if you don't have a stable state, you have Al-Qaeda. Right? All of these things reinforce each other. You've got to defeat the Taliban to have a stable state. You have to have a stable state to defeat the Taliban. So, monism, right? A single vision where no choices are being made, where you're no longer going into Herat and saying, okay, we're going to sit down here with the governor. He is a human rights abusing warlord who believes in Sharia law and hates the international coalition. Nevertheless, in the interests of stability in Western Afghanistan, we're going to cut a deal with him. No, these sort of things don't feature in our political debate. We instead imagine that we're operating in a world in which all good things go together, and we don't need to choose between them. Fourth feature, victims. Right? The fourth feature is we perceive Afghans predominantly as victims. Right? We talk about them as subjects for our charity, people to whom we have to deliver things. Fifth feature, jargon. We talk about the country in the most extraordinary, incomprehensible language. Right? Language that I can't understand and certainly an Afghan can't understand. Right? We talk like consultants. Let me just show you this on the board, just to illustrate this. Right? This is a document produced by a consultant. Last year, out of $4 billion of international aid, $1.3 billion was spent by consultants. Right? In this document, you can discover how it is you are to create a state in Afghanistan, rather like how you might set about baking a cake. It turns out that there are only 10 things you need in a state, ranging from the legitimate monopoly on the means of violence through to the rule of law. And that the way to get there is through the definition of critical tasks, the mobilization of sufficient resources, processes and organizations, stakeholders, and the definition of the rules of the game, monitored through a process of measured through a process of iterative monitoring. Right, that's down at the bottom. What does this mean? Well, it sort of means, I guess, you kind of need a man, you need a plan, and you need to check what you're doing from time to time. Pause on that for a second. This language is very interesting, and it's very, very bewildering, partly because Afghans themselves are very, very good at playing it back to us. Because we are currently engaged in the process of capacity building in civil society, there are hundreds of Afghan non-governmental organizations which are able to turn up to see a USAID official and to talk in very learned terms about conflict resolution or anti-corruption programs or rule of law or governance. But neither they, nor I, nor indeed I imagine 95% of us in the room are very clear what the difference is between law and the rule of law, or between government and governance, nor the difference between security and the legitimate monopoly on the use of violence. These are funny things. That first one is a word that some of you will recognize has been taken from Max Weber, a distinguished German academic writing before the First World War in this particular case. Right? And his notion of legitimate monopoly on the use of violence is something which is very much rooted in a particular idea about the development of the modern European state. What exactly it's doing in our description of Afghanistan is not clear. But one thing is clear. In this language, there is no particularity. There's nothing local. There's nothing historical. The man who is responsible for this document also helped to draft something called the Sustaining Afghanistan Futures document, which became the Afghan National Development Strategy, which is an amazing, great thing, which is meant to guide the international community and which is one of the bedrocks of our strategy in Afghanistan. If you look at the first draft of that, Sustaining Afghanistan's Future, 137 pages long, laying out for the international donors at that time in Germany how to funnel billions of dollars of aid through the Afghan government. The whole 137-page document does not include the following words. There is no mention of the word Pashtun. There is no mention of the word Islam, Sharia, jihad, resistance, insurgency, Hazara, Tajik, communist, Soviet Union. None of these things exist. Indeed, were you to do a replace all and insert the word Botswana, it would be very difficult to know of which country you were speaking. Because there is somewhere underlying this document an idea of a general perfectibility of mankind, a general theory of mankind, that there is some kind of universal consultant who can move effortlessly, learning lessons. The lessons learned units are very important, from Bosnia to Kosovo, from Kosovo to Afghanistan, from Afghanistan to Iraq. The RAND Corporation indeed has published a book called The Beginner's Guide to Nation Building, which tells you how to do this stuff, which assures you that the important thing, Paddy Ashdown, who was the High Representative in Bosnia, and indeed one of the jokes of this thing, is that a great number of the people who were in the Balkans end up in Afghanistan. Right? There was a long time when we were looking for a High Representative in Afghanistan where Paddy Ashdown, who'd been the man running Bosnia, the Office of High Representative in Bosnia, kept coming up. Everybody in NATO kept saying, we need a Paddy Ashdown-like figure. And at the end of 2.5 years of intensive searching, they concluded the only Paddy Ashdown-like figure was indeed Paddy Ashdown. Right? Unfortunately, Karzai was not amused by his desire to share with the President the fact that his great-grandfather had died fighting in the Second Anglo-Afghan War. The second man, of course, of whom this is a great example, is indeed Richard Holbrooke, the great architect of the Dayton Agreement, and now the Afghanistan-Pakistan super envoy. But then there is also Peter Galbraith, who was the deputy head of UNAMA, and who previously had been in Croatia. So, again, these lessons learned. And the general lessons that they take, and of course the most dramatic recent example of lessons learned are the lessons that General David Petraeus or Sandy McChrystal learnt in Iraq and attempting to apply in Afghanistan, is that there is a particular kind of model. There's a particular kind of thing which works pretty much anywhere in the world with a few adjustments, because pretty much anywhere in the world people are the same, societies are the same, and they can be improved provided the correct elite with the correct jargon and the correct ideas turns up at the right time and puts all the bits in place. Right? There is, however, one thing that is never spoken about in the center of all of this, And that is the question of what can we do? The fundamental illusion underlying all of this is the illusion of omnipotence. Right? The idea is, if we want it, we can do it. There is no impossible mission. If things are not going very well, it's that we haven't deployed enough resources. We haven't quite got the tactics right. The previous commander was an idiot. The previous president didn't know what he was doing. We were distracted by Iraq. Something went wrong. But now that we've sorted that out, now that I'm here, now that I've got the money that I demanded, now that I've got my new plan, everything's going to be fine. No mission is impossible. We do not want to take on board the fact that we're limited, and that we're limited in three crucial respects. We're limited in our knowledge, we're limited in our power, and we are limited in our legitimacy. We do not know very much about a country like Afghanistan. I don't know very much about a country like Afghanistan. Even a very distinguished American Special Forces officer, after 3 tours on the ground, embedded with an Afghan unit, living and eating with them, going on operations with them, studying counterinsurgency warfare theory till he's blue in the face, speaking 1 or 2 Afghan languages reasonably well, even he does not know very much about Afghanistan. The intricacies of tribal politics at a local level is something around which we can arrange ourselves, bluff, inform ourselves through the medium of translators, advisors, predecessors, and cobble together some kind of temporary solution. But the level of our knowledge is extremely limited. But it is never going to approach, probably, the knowledge of your average 18-year-old Afghan man who's made no attempt to study any of this, but has simply had the good fortune to spend 18 years of his life growing up in that culture and living there. Our power is limited. Our institutions are not well suited to this task. People are recruited primarily into the army to fight wars and are trained to fight wars. People are primarily recruited and trained in the development agencies to alleviate poverty. People brought into the foreign services, the State Department, Foreign Office, are primarily recruited for their skills at drafting agreements. None of these 3 categories is well suited to the business of the kind of 1920s Chicago ward politics which is involved in dealing with a small Afghan tribal chief. And the final problem is the problem of legitimacy. So even in that rare case where you find somebody who has that knowledge, who has the drive, who, for whatever reason, has the power, you find that perfect Machiavellian prince, that special forces officer, that avatar who can sit on the ground and play these kinds of games. The fundamental final constraint is one of legitimacy. Afghan society, like many societies in the Middle East, is in many ways more conservative, more xenophobic, more conservatively religious than we like to acknowledge. The relationship between ourselves and Afghans in many ways is at best a marriage of convenience. At best, what is happening is a particular Afghan community can see an advantage, an interest in cooperating with us at a particular time and in a particular place to further some particular interests. But it is no great relationship of love and mutual respect. It is instead generally a relationship of suspicion and bewilderment, a relationship where when somebody arrives in your village from Canada in a tank, and you say to them, and you may have been shooting at them earlier in the day, "Why are you here?" And they say, "I've come here to build a girls' school," you think, no, you didn't. You didn't fly 10,000 miles around the world and come to my village in tank and body armor to build a girls' school. No. There must be uranium in the ground. Maybe we have some oil that nobody told us about. And it is extraordinary how a lot of the conspiracy theories, and there are an enormous number of crazy conspiracy theories operating throughout the Middle East, partly reflect the fact that quite a lot of what we're doing looks a bit peculiar. we don't fully understand ourselves why we're there. Now, the honest answer, of course, is that the Canadian soldier may well have turned up in that village quite sincerely, as he says, to build a girls' school. It's just that it doesn't make much sense from the point of view of the villager that somebody would be involved in that kind of operation for that purpose. Afghanistan doesn't have any oil, really. I mean, there's a bit of oil apparently in geological reports found by the Russians in the 1980s, but it's not coming out of the ground. I mean, it's not Iraq, right? And yet an enormous number of Afghans are very, very convinced that the main reason we're there must be to get our hands on something of that sort. It isn't true. I mean, it's not a good description, but it's a conspiratorial theory. Okay, so to move on to questions. What ought we to do? This is my final bit, and then I will shut up and stop ranting, right? What should we do? Well, I think what we should do is almost reverse all these tendencies if we are to have a reasonable, rational, pragmatic, sensible, passionately moderate policy in Afghanistan. It is tonight passionate moderation that I want to sell you. Right? Not a black and white, not an either or, not increase or withdrawal, engagement or isolation, not let's put in 40,000 more troops or let's run for the exit, but instead what would it mean for a mature, powerful country like the United States or like some of its allies to engage in a difficult country like Afghanistan? What sort of things can we do there? What sort of things can't we do there? How many resources does it really justify? How much energy and how much time does it justify? Well, the way in which I think one might think about that is by reversing almost all the tendencies which I've raised. Instead of thinking in the most general and abstract terms, and using this very abstract jargon, try to think in the most particular and local terms. Try to think in terms of very, very concrete examples, very specific places. Get out of the idea that we're engaged in the process of creating rule of law, and try to get a sense of what's actually happening at a village level when justice is taking place. And this is something that, in fact, the military and the DoD, to give them credit, has made an enormous amount of progress on over the last 8 years. Instead of being focused on our omnipotence, focus on the limits to our power, our knowledge, and our legitimacy. Recognize those things that we cannot do. With our moral obligation, recognize that those constraints on our power constrain our moral obligation, are limits to our moral obligation. Instead of fears, unbounded, limitless fears of terrorists and a collapsing Pakistan and the erosion of our credibility, instead we should acknowledge that this is a place which is dangerous, which matters, but is one of 40 countries that matter. That it's probably not, in the end, vital to the national security of the United States, that it is desirable that we should do our best to ensure that terrorist training camps are not again constructed in Afghanistan, that we should do our best to ensure that it doesn't destabilize the region dramatically, that we should manage the risks to our reputation, our credibility, but that these things may be better dealt with through that kind of language, the language of management, the language of containment, rather than the language of fixing or building. In analyzing our options on the ground, it would probably mean taking all these things and looking at the things that we've done well over the last 8 years and the things that we've done badly. We know what we've done well and we know what we've done badly. We've listed them out again and again and again in all these international conferences, right? And we normally call the things we've done well successes and the things that we've done badly challenges. The things that we've done well turn out to be the creation of a stable currency, good central bank, the provision of education, so you'll hear everybody talk endlessly about 3 million more children in school, of whom 2 million are women. Access to healthcare, 85% access to healthcare. The training of the Afghan National Army, a relative success. Road infrastructure, urban regeneration, rural programs, something called National Solidarity Program, which gives money to rural villages and allows the villages how to allocate that money to the kind of projects they want to pursue. Health indicators, again, access to healthcare, but health indicators up, improving. And then there's another category of things which we haven't done so well on. And those will be very familiar to you. Counter-narcotics, in other words, stopping Afghanistan from growing 93% of the world's heroin. Counterinsurgency, defeating the Taliban. The creation of good governance, the elimination of corruption, the rule of law, civil society, a stable state. Now, normally confronted with this, the police, something we haven't done so well on. We did relatively well in the army, we did badly on the police. Normally confronted with this kind of binary position, the response of the international community is to take money out of the successes and to put it into the other category, which we call challenges. Take money, for example, out of the north and center of Afghanistan, where things are going well, and put money into the south and east of Afghanistan, where things are not going well. Take money and invest it heavily in new programs on justice, rule of law, policing, governance, anti-corruption, state building. My instinct would be that this is the wrong thing to do. This is the wrong thing to do in a country where we've already been in there 8 years. We've already tried a lot of things. We've already spent a lot of money. And where it's not quite clear to us whether it's in our strategic interest to have this level of resource investment in that particular country. We may not even need to get dragged in too much into the question of why some of these things succeed and the others fail. I mean, we can speculate about that, and we can speculate that maybe we do better at the army than we do on the police because armies may be easier to train than the police. It may be no accident that in almost every country in the developing world, the army is more respected than the police. In Indonesia, as in Pakistan, as in Turkey, the army does better than the police. So it's probably not actually necessary an indictment of the international community or even of Afghanistan that things should be going better with the former than with the latter. It may be that other things, rule of law, governance, corruption, may be more culturally related than the creation of a stable currency and a central bank. We may, as foreigners, simply have the technical skills, the wherewithal to deliver the first category of things in a way that we can't really deliver the latter. Perhaps because Afghans are less happy to cooperate with us or work with us on some of those issues because they may be more intimately connected with aspects of society, family, religion, culture. It doesn't matter what the reason is, though, in the end. I think it's fair enough to say we spent 8 years, these are the things we seem to be able to do. For whatever reason, we're not making much progress in the others, and I can't really see the point of throwing good money after bad. Does that mean that we withdraw? Oh, and another success. Another great success is that we've managed to convince Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, broadly speaking, not to be in Afghanistan, but instead to be in Pakistan. It's something we succeeded in doing. It's something we continue to succeed in doing. And it's something I believe we can continue to succeed in doing if that's what we want to do. Right? And actually, it's quite interesting. I mean, that's just as a sort of coda on this, because we have all these assumptions about failed states and development. And if you were really, really to invest in Afghanistan and to be really lucky, get all your money going in the right direction, have some really smart people, have a very cooperative Afghan leadership, a great Afghan president, a society that was absolutely behind you, an enormous amount of energy. If you were really lucky, you could make Afghanistan in 30 years' time look more like Pakistan and less like Chad, right? Pakistan is 20, 30 years ahead of Afghanistan in almost every indicator. Its institutions, its judiciary, its civil society, its education levels, its health levels, its economy. Pakistan is a different league from Afghanistan. And yet, curiously, when you went through that whole process of building up institutions, building up the state, building up the economy, getting development going, you'd find out that actually Osama bin Laden might prefer to be in Pakistan than in Afghanistan. Right? That raises a question. And one of the questions it raises is whether we're right in our failed state theory. Right? Afghanistan is a more failed state than Pakistan. And we blind ourselves to that fact. I mean, in terms of the relative failure of states in the world, Pakistan is, I suppose, top of the bottom third rubbishy state, and Afghanistan is right down at the very bottom. Right? Probably the reason why Osama bin Laden, in some sense, is in Pakistan, not Afghanistan, is because Pakistan is more of a state. It has more sovereignty. It has a government that's able to turn around to the United States and its allies and say, actually, we don't really want 100,000 of your troops in our country, right? We're imposing severe limits on the ability of your intelligence operatives and special forces to move around. In some ways, in terms of very narrow definition of counterterrorism, a failed state is quite convenient for us. I mean, if what you're really trying to do is make absolutely sure that someone doesn't build a Quantico-style camp, right? It's quite convenient to have a failed state because you can fly your helicopter anywhere. You can put your troops anywhere. You can do whatever you want because the Karzai government isn't going to tell you not to. The states that are actually more threatening are probably the states that are a little bit wealthier, have their stuff a little bit together. The Pakistans, the Irans of the world, as opposed to the Afghanistans, the Somalias, the Yemens. And this shouldn't be a surprise to us. I mean, when we say to when we say to Pakistan or to Iran, please help us in the development projects in Afghanistan. You know, come on board, let's build a state, let's make it more wealthy, let's invest in its institutions. The response from the Iranians is, why should we? Why on earth would we want to build up a state which is a potential enemy on our borders? They simply don't buy the logic that a failed state is the most dangerous thing in the world. As far as they're concerned, a failed state is something they can manage. They're much more troubled by the idea that you'd invest in making Afghanistan more wealthy, more prosperous, more stable, more humane. So why then would we want to make Afghanistan more prosperous, stable, humane? Because I think that's what we should be doing. I think the answers are twofold. One of them is that we do have a form of moral obligation towards the Afghan people, a limited moral obligation, not a blank check obligation. But we have created a lot of mess in that country. We do have the power to help in certain respects. And insofar as we can do so, I think we as a country would be proud to provide that kind of assistance. And we also have some national security interests in that country, which in our case, but not so much in the case of Iran or Pakistan, might be better served by the country getting itself together, the institutions developing a little bit more, and trying to ensure that the various problems, right, that Afghanistan is faced with are not going to be there forever. How do we do this? We do this, I believe, not through a counterinsurgency campaign, not through huge amounts of resources and money. We try to do it instead through a light long-term footprint. Why a light long-term footprint? Because I think that gives you leverage. It gives you leverage over your own military. It gives you leverage over the Afghan government. It gives you leverage over the Taliban. Leverage over the Afghan government because at the moment the worse they behave, the more we give them. The more drugs they have, the more terrorists they have, the more Taliban they have, the more unstable they are, the more we give them. Oh, this is terrible, this is a terrible state. Quick, we must send some more troops, we must give them some more money. I had a very senior Afghan government official ring me up a year ago and say, stop describing us as a humanitarian problem. We have to be the number one terrorist threat in the world. And I said, why have you got to be the number one terrorist threat in the world? And he said, if we're not the number one terrorist threat in the world, we're not going to get any more money. We're going to be treated like some African country. Now, the reason I raise that is that you can see the logic subconsciously, but when you actually get, and this was one of the four most senior people, or was, he is no longer, but was one of the four most senior people around the Afghan president, saying that to you completely explicitly and consciously, you realize how some of these structures are operating. So by detaching, by saying, yes, okay, this is a country where we would like to do some good and where we have some interest, but there are limits to it. It's not the be-all and end-all. We're not terrified by this country. We can, if we want, withdraw without it being the end of the world. You get a bit of leverage over the Afghan government. You get yourself into a situation where you can credibly say to them, no, actually, you're getting this the wrong way around. If you keep spawning drugs, Taliban, and failing to sort out the corruption and failing to build a decent state, you're on your own, as opposed to what we say at the moment, which is the worse you behave, the more we give you. But it also, finally, I think, could give you more leverage over the Taliban, because the Taliban, I think, from their point of view, have got us, to some extent, where they want us. They've got us into a position of overstretch. They and various other global jihadist groups around the world have got us now in the situation where even the great US military is pretty stretched, pretty tired, dealing with an enormous number of different problems, an enormous number of people on the ground, and we're spending a lot of money. And although in historical terms they're not huge, actually we are taking pretty significant casualties and even more significant numbers of people wounded. And the larger our presence on the ground and more expensive it is, the more of a backlash is going to happen. The more people that you put in, the more the pressure to withdrawal increases. You can see this in Obama's speech. President Obama's speech says, basically he makes a deal. He buys force by giving away time. He says, I'm going to put in 40,000 more troops, and I'm going to begin the drawdown in July of next year. So that Mephistophelian bargain, that Faustian pact where you win force and lose time, is at the bottom of why it is the Taliban believe they can outweight us and outlast us. From their point of view, we have a completely extravagant, unjustifiable, unsustainable, fragile presence in that country, one that we cannot plausibly maintain. Right? If you were instead able to reframe this from the beginning as a light, long-term footprint, I think you'd be more likely to be able to keep the support of your own domestic voters, less likely to promote a backlash, and more likely to be able to say credibly to the Taliban, hey, we're not going away. We're not doing a counterinsurgency campaign. We're not chasing you around rural areas, but we're not going away. We're here. And you're not going to be able to take a city so long as we're here. You're never going to have a conventional option so long as we're here. You're never going to be able to roll tanks and artillery up the main road to Kabul. You're never again going to have the kind of situation that you faced in 1995 where there was a civil war in the streets of Kabul which you could walk into. We're here. So if you want to be part of this, you have to negotiate. And the only way they are going to do that is when they acknowledge the truth, which is that actually they, the Taliban, are not that powerful. They need to be made to see the truth, which is that people in the center and the north of the country don't want them. They're never going to be able to take over the country again, and they need to come to the table. A policy then of passionate moderation, a policy then predicated above all, I hope, on reasonableness, on a sense of our limits, a sense of what we can and can't do, a sense of what Afghans do or do not want us to do, a sense of what other things we might want to do, a more mature policy, a policy, and this is the line in which I'm going to end so that we can move on to questions, policy may be summed up best in the words of a great American, T.S. Eliot, whose family came from not far from here, come to think of it, who says the only wisdom is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. Thank you all very much indeed. Right. Well, I believe we have about half an hour for questions. So please ask some questions. Sir, yeah. I think, actually, sorry, if you could come to the microphones would be great if you wanted to ask a question. Yeah.
In our government, either in state or defense, who would share and espouse the things that you've said here tonight?
Okay, so the question for those of you at the back in here is anyone in the state or defense administration who'd espouse the kind of views that I'm rehearsing tonight. I think one of the problems with this whole thing is that, yes, of course, they would agree with many of the things that I say. And one of the problems is that even in, and that was a really, and I apologize for it, that was a very, very long, detailed rant that I gave, right? But as you can imagine, even with a long, detailed rant, you're only scratching the surface of this kind of problem. Underlying the disagreement between myself and somebody like General Petraeus are probably 500 different assumptions about the world. Different views of history, different views of counterinsurgency, different views, for example, about what happened in Iraq. What was the surge in Iraq? General Petraeus believes a certain kind of thing about that. I believe a different kind of thing about that. And on the basis of that disagreement, he thinks that he can do something broadly similar in Afghanistan, and I think he doesn't have a chance. Right? But to begin to parse these things out, as you can imagine, even a very patient man like General Petraeus is not likely to want to spend 15 hours arguing point by point through every assumption of this strategy, which would involve, amongst other things, us disagreeing about what happened in Afghanistan in the 1990s, disagreeing about the relationship between Taliban and Al-Qaeda, disagreeing about analogies with Malaya, disagreeing about our views on the respective strategic interests of the United States and Somalia, disagreeing on our views of failed states. I mean, this is a whole cultural context. This is a whole worldview. I mean, in a sense, what has happened is that two main ideological things have taken over the world of foreign policy, and they are counterinsurgency warfare theory and failed state theory. And on the basis of these two hypnotizing ideas, everything else follows. And one of the consequences of this is that you get yourself into a situation in which the military is very powerful. The generals are always very, very powerful. In fact, the sort of circles of influence. Basically, I don't think it's possible for President Obama really to take on General Petraeus or General McChrystal. It's just too difficult for a civilian politician today. The general comes in, he's got medals all over his chest, he's done 3 or 4 tours on the ground. He says, this is the way it is, these are the resources I need, this is what we've concluded on the basis of our huge numbers of studies with hundreds of consultants and goodness knows how many millions of dollars spent on various kinds of research programs and projects. It would take a very, very unusual civilian to say, General, you're wrong. You don't have a hope. You're not going to win this one. This is doomed. You've misunderstood it. Your research is wrong. Your assumptions are wrong. Your counterinsurgency warfare theory is completely inappropriate. It's a series of myths cobbled together from inappropriate analogies from other countries. This isn't going to make it. In fact, in 20 years' time, people are going to look back on you with pity. Right? You're not going to get a president saying that to a serving general. Right? So what is my experience of talking to the administration? My experience is that 95% of the things I say, people nod and agree, but may not fully understand what I'm trying to say. And they basically think I'm a sort of pessimist, that I'm over the top, that it can't be quite as bad as all that. That, this guy, he spent a bit of time in Afghanistan, but he's been in the north, the center of the country, doesn't understand much about the south and the east. And anyway, he doesn't really understand how many advances we've made in the last 4 years in counterinsurgency warfare theory and failed state strategy. And anyway, he doesn't understand the domestic political considerations. He doesn't understand how we'd be hammered in the midterms if we did this, that, or the other. So that you're left with this funny view that if in the weirdest situation, just imagine the hypothetical situation that I'm right? Just imagine that if this funny video that's being played now in 30 years' time stood up, it turned out that my analysis was correct. It would be, it wouldn't be an analysis which the administration today is really very willing to fully take on board. Not that they can't see what the ingredients are, not that they can't see the sorts of things I'm pointing at, but just that it all seems a bit depressing. And that we're there now, and we've lost a lot of lives, and we've spent a lot of money, and it looks really nasty, and surely we ought to do something, and we can't just go around being gloomy all the time. Anyway, that's my view on that. Thanks.
Robert Kaplan, in the, I'm sure you're aware of this, in The Atlantic, cites you as proposing that even if the Taliban came back and had at least a sphere of a territory in Afghanistan, they would not be hospitable to Al-Qaeda. Is this a correct characterization of your opinion? And if it is, on what basis do you make that proposition?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The bottom line on Afghanistan, it is an unbelievably unpredictable place. Right? I'm obsessed with the fact that if someone had said in 1994 that within 2 years, the civil war, which was raging in the central Kabul, so 94, rockets, mortars hammering into the old city of Kabul, all the great old jihadi commanders with 15 years of experience and millions of dollars and lots of weapons fighting it out, scores of checkposts on the roads between Kabul and Kandahar, terror, refugees, etc. Somebody was to say in 1994, all this will have gone in 2 years' time. Within 2 years, the civil war will be ended. All these Mujahideen commanders will be on the run. The main road between Kabul and Kandahar will be something that you could walk from end to end without being worried, and nobody's going to rob you. Nobody would believe it. And particularly when they said, who's going to do it? And you said, well, there's a completely unknown group called the Taliban out there, who you've never heard of, but they're a bunch of young students from madrasas in Pakistan, and they're going to be able to defeat all these great commanders, wrap it up, and open the roads again with no money, no support, no international legitimacy. Right? You wouldn't believe it. Nevertheless, it happened. So I would be foolish to say what Afghanistan would look like in 5 or 10 years' time. My best guess is that the Taliban are extremely unlikely to be able to take over the country again. Right? This is not 1995. In 1995, they came into a situation in which there was a civil war. They came into a situation in which the Mujahideen commanders were beating each other up. They came into a situation where there was no international presence. They came in with the support of the Pakistan military. Since then, they've discredited themselves in government. The north and the center of the country is much more powerful than it was, much more unified than it was, right? So I think it's extremely unlikely they'd take over the country. I also believe that even were they to take over the country, it is extremely unlikely that they would invite back al-Qaeda. From the point of view of most of the Taliban, that was their only mistake. Without al-Qaeda, they'd still be in power. The only reason we got rid of them September the 11th is because of al-Qaeda. I mean, they have no particular interest in this group. It provides some kind of financial support for them. It provides some kind of legitimacy for them. But from the point of view of many people in the Taliban, they cannot believe that this is a crucial part of their campaign to take over the country and reestablish Sharia law. They continue to have xenophobic views on them. But the third thing is, even if I'm wrong about those two things, right, even in that 5% of a 5% that the Taliban could take over the country and that they invited back al-Qaeda, I still don't believe that's such a big problem for us. I'd almost rather have al-Qaeda in Afghanistan than I would in Pakistan. Were they to invite back in Osama bin Laden and he was to try to build a Quantico-style camp in Afghanistan, I think even at that stage, that's something that we could contain and manage and that we would be much more willing to deal with than we were in 1999 or 2000. We have far more commitment to that kind of project. We have far more resources committed to that kind of project. So I just don't think it's that big a deal. My prediction is they won't take the country, and if they do, they won't bring back al-Qaeda. But my real fundamental belief is even if they did, right, even in that worst-case scenario, and this is fundamental, you do not run your foreign policy on worst-case scenarios. There are worst-case scenarios all over the world that you can imagine from one end to the other. If you start jumping at every shadow and imagining the worst-case scenario in every country and deploying resources accordingly, we'd be bankrupt tomorrow. But even in that situation, I think it's something that we would be able to manage and that we could focus on managing. No. Please.
Mr. Stewart, I would like to shift this to a personal question. What motivated you in 1991 to walk across this incredibly volatile, dangerous country on foot, not knowing what was ahead?
No, I'm very, very bad at answering that question. It's a very kind question, and I know it was meant in a kind way. I think I don't know, I was much younger then. I thought it was going to impress the girls. Okay, it impressed one, okay. It didn't impress any others, I can tell you. No, I mean, whatever I thought I was doing when I did it, the benefit that I took from it is that I was able to stay in 500 different village houses along the way. It took me 21 months. And because I was only walking 20, 25 miles a day, I ended up accidentally in these places where I spent night after night listening to families talk about their religion, talk about government, talk about Islam. And at the end of it, I had some sense that when I was sitting in the room in Kabul and heard somebody say every Afghan is committed to a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law, that I didn't really know how to translate that into language which would work in those communities. So it gave me, as somebody who's engaged in foreign policy, a certain kind of confidence, a certain ability to be a little bit more stubborn and bloody-minded and say, I don't believe this, I don't think this is really going to work, than I might have had if I hadn't done it. But why I did it, I think I think I was a bit deluded.
If elected, what would you like to accomplish as a member of Parliament, and what drew you to the Conservative Party?
Okay, what would I like to accomplish as a member of Parliament? I would like to accomplish, firstly, the creation of a sensible, rational, passionately moderate foreign policy for Britain, right? I want Britain not to exist in this weird relationship with the world. You know, I've talked a lot about the problems with the United States policy in Afghanistan. It is as nothing compared to the problems of the policy of Britain in Afghanistan, right? At least you are responsible, right? At least this is your project. The bottom line, sadly, in many ways, and the way in which every other NATO country is involved, is that they are there for one reason and one reason only, which is they want to be friendly with the United States, right? If you are Estonia, you don't feel Afghanistan as a vital national security threat to Estonia, right? You are there because you want to be a good member of NATO and you want to please the United States. And this then means that the policy of every other country except for the United States is really demented, because they're not actually asking themselves, does this really make sense? Are we really making progress? Can we really do this? Because it doesn't really matter to Estonia. I mean, Estonia would be doing it if we were, you know, painting elephants pink and dancing around in ballerina suits. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? What matters is part of this relationship. And one of the problems for Britain, I mean, obviously Britain is a larger country than Estonia and has a bigger presence on the ground, but a big driver of the whole thing is this idea of the special relationship with the United States, which manifests itself in the British being incredibly pompous and chippy. So, right, the basic British response in this kind of scenario is to feel trapped, insecure, and pompous, so that you have all my friends and colleagues spend their entire time lecturing Americans about Northern Ireland and Malaya and the British Empire and this, that, and the other, and generally implying that somehow if they were in charge, the whole thing would be going much better and that they're much cleverer and much more subtle and they have a historical imagination and this kind of stuff, while at the same time not quite delivering, because they don't really believe in it and they're a bit grumpy and they don't really feel that they're in charge, and so that they're not actually always, for example, in Basra in Iraq, doing quite as well as they could do. This is not good. This creates a situation where my own country is, is two-faced, right? I mean, in dealing with the United States, it says, we're your greatest allies, we're with you, and then as soon as they go home, they grumble and they slag off the United States, right? It's the same in our relationship to Europe. Hooray, yeah, we're here, we're in Europe, we love Europe, Europe's great, you know, when we're hanging out with the French and the Germans, and as soon as we go home, we begin attacking Brussels for trying to straighten our bananas and interfering in our kind of bits of our life, right? Which creates the great idea, which the French like, of perfidious Albion, right? The hypocritical English. So that's one thing. Second thing, I would like to have a conversation about common sense in Britain, by which I mean the fact that we are stuck in a weird world of consultancy jargon and language and regulations and paperwork, which are an exercise in oppression and bad faith. I'm now beginning to sound like a kind of Tea Party candidate, but which are really bizarre, right? I mean, I go into a bed and breakfast in Cumbria to see people filling out forms every day to run their bed and breakfast, which force them to lie, right? Old ladies sitting down with this form, have you ever had a pet in your kitchen? No. Right? When did you last check the temperature of your refrigerator? Ooh, this morning. Right? Right? Anyway, I mean, then rural affairs. I mean, I represent a rural constituency, and our market towns and our villages are being stripped out. We're losing again and again our schools, our hospitals, our pubs, our pharmacies, our GPs clinics. All of them are being stripped out and replaced by huge out-of-town centers, schools amalgamated and consolidated, hospitals further and further away, supermarkets arriving on the edge of towns, and everything that represents our communities and our lives being removed under the most specious of economic arguments and the most dubious of reasons. So those are a few things. But I'd also like to make it more fun as a profession. I mean, I just think the basic problem with being a British politician is that everybody thinks you're a liar and a cheat, right, all the time. It's a completely humiliating, dishonorable profession. It's really weird. I mean, I think it's very dangerous to spend your whole time telling people they're liars and cheats, because they then become liars and cheats, as our MPs have just displayed in their expenses scandal.
آقای سلام علیکم، چطور هستین؟ صحت شما خوب است؟ بخیر هستین؟ Mr. Rai, I'm an Afghan Fulbright student in Kansas University. I read your book. It was very interesting, and I liked it. I hope you talk about it, and I just wanted to know, why did you choose this particular area from Herat to Kabul? And now coming to more questions, as we know that during the Taliban regime, we had lots of, bad things from them, but there were major issues which they could handle it very well. That was banned on narcotics or drugs. That we know it was zero. And they had a very good security. They didn't have any, corrupt government. And there were about lots of good things. But today in our country, we have more than, 32 countries with their arms, with their, support, an Afghan army, an Afghan government. But still, the country is facing lots of problems, which includes, insecurity. It is the biggest, producer of the drugs of the world, and there's not stability. So don't you think these are very, to some extent, some good and valid reasons for the Afghan to doubt the military presence of the international community? And the next question, have you ever thought if it's really, a failed state or a failed democracy in Afghanistan?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so these we don't have much time. So, in essence, you've made your points very eloquently, and it's not really necessary for me to recapitulate them. But there is something a bit odd about the Taliban period, which is that it was a very brutal government, right? These are extremely unpleasant people with a very narrow view of the world. Nevertheless, they do seem to be able to deliver basic justice and security, and not primarily through brutality. And they were able, to some extent, to control in their final year the production of narcotics. And they were able to do so without the kind of financial or military resources that we're currently investing in Afghanistan. They ran the country with a tin box under a bed. They didn't have a very well-trained military. By comparison, the Afghan National Army is in a completely different category to anything the Taliban ever had. We've invested billions of dollars a year in training it. We're probably going to be spending close to $100 billion this year alone in Afghanistan. At the time when the Taliban were in power, their entire revenue would have been something in the region of $150 million. Right? So 1/1000th of the amount that we're going to be putting into that country. And yet they were able to, broadly speaking, let you walk down a road without being robbed, broadly speaking, get some kind of modicum of justice without paying a bribe, able to control the production of narcotics. Now, how does this happen? Well, it's obviously something to do with legitimacy. It's something to do with how citizens relate to their government. And although the Taliban had a number of really horrendous attributes, and I don't need to recite them here, but mass executions, the complete exclusion of women from schools, a really stupid, illiterate culture. From the point of view of a Kabuli, the Taliban arriving in Kabul is a bit like a bunch of West Virginia militiamen taking over San Francisco. Right? They come in and they were hanging televisions from trees. They were making people hated that stuff. But they did nevertheless have something approaching a kind of legitimacy, which the Karzai government doesn't seem to be able to mobilize. And those legitimacies in Afghanistan would be different. Under the king, it was based on hereditary descent. Right? The legitimacy of the king is that he was the son of the king. the legitimacy of the communist regime was based on certain kinds of ideas of equality and redistribution. The legitimacy of the Taliban is based on Sharia. It's based on theology, theocracy, God. What is the basis of the legitimacy of this government? The answer is theoretically democracy. And yet we've seen a very peculiar, very flawed election. It's far from clear that that election in any way increased the legitimacy of the current government. The legitimacy of the current government, in fact, is predicated on one thing above all. It's seen as being the conduit to foreign resources. Karzai's competitive advantage is seen as being he's the man who can deal with the foreigners, who can bring the money in. And that creates a very, very odd codependent relationship between himself and his people and between himself and the international community, which probably doesn't create stability. This question, please.
This will have to be the last question, please.
You say that what's needed in Afghanistan is a light, long-term footprint. How long is long-term and how light is light?
It's a very good question. I guess you're looking for a footprint which is sufficiently light and long-term to fulfill the following three conditions. It would need to be sufficient to provide a situation where the Taliban were not able to seize Kabul and were not able to mobilize a serious conventional force. Right? It could allow the Taliban to massively increase their presence in the south and east of the country. They could spawn a widespread guerrilla movement, but not get into the position where they actually are able to form major armies, move around with their artillery and tanks. So that light presence would probably involve keeping a certain amount of air power on the ground. A second thing that you would need, I think, is to continue to provide serious financial support to the Afghan government. The Najib government collapsed in the 1990s, not really because of the Soviet withdrawal, which happened 2.5 years earlier, but because they stopped writing checks to them. You would have to continue to provide generous financial support to the Karzai government. You would probably also want to keep sufficient numbers of special forces and their support teams on the ground to ensure that Osama bin Laden did not feel comfortable about building a Quantico-style camp. And you would need the force protection to keep what I'm imagining as troops basically in a base in a relatively friendly area in the north or the center of Afghanistan. What does this mean? Well, it means a very nasty, messy situation. Nasty, messy situation because in the worst-case scenario, it would tend towards civil war. Even in the best-case scenario, it would significantly increase the Taliban presence in the south and east of the country. In the best-case scenario, it would involve some kind of power sharing with the Taliban having some position in government. How long? Well, I suppose if you felt that you were month by month contributing to Afghanistan becoming more stable, prosperous, and humane in 30 years' time than it is today, and you were doing so at a minimal loss of casualties, which again, you'd need to define, and you can ask me how much that is. I don't know how much that is, but considerably less, maybe 1/10 of what we're losing at the moment. And with an expenditure which was a few billion rather than $100 billion a year, then I suppose you might be able to explain to the public and explain to your military and explain to the Afghan people why you might want to stay in the country for as long as 30 years. But you would have to do so in a way that was very, very clearly designed to be extremely limited in its ambitions and very limited in the amount of troops and money invested in the country. Okay, sorry, let me just very, very quickly just finish. Thank you very much, above all, for your patience. Please understand that I am freelancing here. I'm moving over a huge amount of territory, which is not my speciality. I'm presuming to talk about military theory, I'm presuming to talk about diplomacy, I'm presuming to talk about the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan or the internal dynamics of Pakistan. This stuff, I'm going to be wrong about a lot of this stuff. I can't be right about all of this stuff, right? I do think, though, that if there is one message that I'd like to get across here, is that we need to be less insecure, less paranoid, less megalomaniac in our attitudes towards the world. And that if we look carefully at our capacities, our astonishing capacities, because we really are, the United States as allies is really capable of astonishing things if properly deployed at the right kinds of project, the right kinds of initiative, with the right kind of support, we will find that with that, and with most of all the incredible potential of Afghanistan itself, of Afghans and their political leadership, that an honest look at those things, an honest look at our limits and capacities will lead us to conclude that although we can do much less than we pretend, we can do much more than we fear. Thank you very much indeed, and good night.